Thank you, Professor Lewis, for talking to me about Mother Earth. You've observed what's happening to many of our tropical forests. How do these delicate places balance the environment?
Well, tropical rainforests are incredibly important in that they are home to more than half the world's types of plants and animals. So millions of species live there. They are also home to tens of millions of people. And they help balance the environment by producing rainfall. So that hot rainfall falls down, and then those trees produce rainfall themselves again to keep that cycle going. And they're also full of giant trees. And half the dry weight of a tree is carbon. So they are really big stores of carbon. And they are keeping that carbon locked up out of the atmosphere and available as food for all those other animals that are ultimately living on those trees. So they are really important ecosystems in the world.
How can we reverse our effect on the forest?
Well, the main thing we can do to reverse our effects on tropical forests is to stop cutting them down. And we're mostly cutting them down for agriculture. So we can reduce those impacts by demanding that governments have laws in place to stop illegal deforestation and that those laws are enacted and enforced. We can also say to companies, demand that the food we buy in a supermarket or on the market, the furniture that people buy is all coming from sustainably managed sources and is not coming from degraded lands. And crucially, we need to stop the hunting trade of hunting wild animals to sell to people living in cities for food and for medicines. And these things taken together can really help protect the forests so long as we give the forest lands back to the indigenous peoples and local peoples who are the very best long-term stewards of those forests because they live there and they depend on them.
I live in a forest with many magical animals. I don't see a lot of my friends anymore. What has happened to them? Is there a mass extinction happening? How can we change this?
In lots of places, the animals really are in trouble. And they're in trouble because people are hunting them, but they're also in trouble because the area of forest has got so small that there's not so much room for all these animals. And then these animals are in patches of forest often, and it's hard for them to get from one patch of forest to another patch of forest as they've been isolated. And all these impacts push these animal species closer and closer to extinction. Now, we do have an extinction crisis. Extinction levels are very high compared to normal times in geological history. But we are not yet at a mass extinction event. If we continue what we're doing for decades and decades and decades, we will reach that crisis point. So we can change, and we can change direction. And that means protecting the forest we've got and also reconnecting the forests so that animals can move around and that they can move as the climate changes. And to do that is going to require a big effort from people on the ground who are the best protectors of those forests, but also the international community to say enough is enough. We need to protect what we've got and restore what we've previously destroyed.
In India, we had the Chipko movement, which was one of the first grassroots environmental movements, and it stopped deforestation in northern India. What have we learned from this? How can people organize to make local changes that affect them directly?
I think the Chipko movement has been incredibly inspirational, including to me. I'm a scientist now, but back in the 1990s, the British government wanted to build roads through forests. And we were inspired by the Chipko movement to surround those trees with our bodies and say, you mustn't cut these trees down. And while we lost some battles, we did win the war in that 700 plans for new roads to destroying the natural environment were stopped by people power. And what the Chipko movement shows is that if communities really work together for their own benefit, they can really stop these outside forces coming in to chop down their forests and their homes.
Why is biodiversity important?
Biodiversity is important, both its intrinsic value, just to know it's there for its own sake, but it's also helping us. And it's helping us because these species, they help regulate the climate. They're also helping to slow climate change by removing carbon dioxide and carbon pollution from the atmosphere and slowing the rate of climate change. They're also, biodiversity and tropical forests are home to millions of people. And they're also the source of foodstuffs and the source of medicines. And I think very importantly, also the source of inspiration, not only for inspiration for new medicines, but inspiration for all sorts of new scientific discoveries. So they're really, this network of plants and animals is really important to us in that what would we eat if there was no biodiversity? How would the natural cycles operate that allow us to grow the food and for food plants to be pollinated if there were no biodiversity? We tend to think of it as being in the background, but actually it's really central to our current and future prosperity.
In London and in New Delhi, we live comfortable lives. Why should people living in these cities care about what happens to the environment elsewhere?
What happens elsewhere in the world is intimately connected to other places. We're all connected through climate change. When people are chopping down forests, that carbon is going into the atmosphere and is exacerbating the impacts of climate change, which we will feel strongly in New Delhi and in London, because those heat waves are going to hit big cities, big metropolises really hard. We're also all connected by food prices. And what climate change and biodiversity loss can do is disrupt and reduce the yields that farmers get, which, if it happens on a big scale or in a couple of places around the world at the same time, could lead to big increases in food prices that we will really notice and the poorest people will really suffer from. And we're all really interconnected. We know this through the COVID-19 crisis. What happened in the UK and what happened in India were connected. We can't isolate ourselves from the world's problems. And that means we need to work together to tackle those problems and tackle them in a way that helps people, the poorest people in New Delhi, as much as the poorest people in my city, London.
What is one good thing all children can do now which will have a good effect on our planet?
I think the really most important thing that children can do is talk about these issues and talk about the problems. Because from talking about them, we can then work together and formulate action plans to tackle them. And that might be like the Chipko movement, where you actually have to go and surround the trees to stop someone cutting them down. Or it might be lobbying your government for better laws. Or it might be joining all the school strikes children, Greta Thunberg and all the other children who are saying, no, we're not going to go to lessons on Fridays. We're going to voice our opinion that the world is going in the wrong direction and the adults aren't doing enough. So we're going to stand up and make our voices count. But all that starts from talking about it.
All the news about the environment seems bad. Are there any glimmers of hope? How can we overcome fear to tackle climate change?
I do feel that the news we get is very depressing. There are new records of temperatures, new droughts, new forest fires that we see, new statistics, more plastic pollution. But the crucial thing is that we mustn't give up hope and we mustn't give up taking action. Because those things will only change when we do. In terms of climate change, if we change the investment patterns, if we stop investing in coal power and invest in renewables, we will change the future. Vastly for the better. So it's incumbent, it's important for all of us to use our voices and take the thing that we're most passionate about and talk about climate change in that sphere. Because if you're really passionate about it, then you'll make things happen in that sphere. And climate change, one of the issues is that it's so all-encompassing, but it's also one of the benefits if you want to get involved in taking action. Because you might be involved in a football, but football needs to go green. You might be going to college. Your college needs to go green. Whatever it is that makes you really enthusiastic, make that sustainable. And then we'll be on a better path.